So I'm thrilled to have Jud Brewer here. He is a New York Times bestselling author and thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery, having combined over 20 years of experience with mindfulness training and scientific research. He is the director of research and innovation at the Mindfulness Center and associate professor in behavioral and social sciences and psychiatry at the Schools of Public Health and Medicine at Brown University. He's also the executive medical director of behavioral health at ShareCare, and a research affiliate at MIT. As a psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for addictions, Brewer has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for habit change, including both in-person and app-based treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety, all of which I use with my clients regularly and are fantastic. And he is the author of two of my favorite books, The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits, and the New York Times bestseller, Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. Welcome, Jud. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And to be honest, after reading your bio and the topic being striving, you are a striver. Let's just say that. So I'm really curious to talk about, for you, striving and actually how you do it in a way that's more meaningful and more about curiosity than necessarily about outcome. And but maybe a good place to start before we even get into unpacking that is your sort of perspective on what healthy striving looks like versus unhealthy striving.
I'd be happy to. The way I look at this is if it feels like striving, it's unhealthy striving, in the sense that when something is naturally drawing us forward, it feels very different than when we feel like we have to push ourselves forward. And so I think we can find conditions and we can find our own mental states and our own mental capacities so that we can be, when we're passionate about something, we can be drawn forward in a way that's natural, that's organic, and I will argue effortless, where we don't feel like we are having to push ourselves forward to literally, grit our teeth to strive. So that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also links a lot to how you're approaching our habit cycles and craving and addiction. So I'd love to just sort of unpack your model of habits, because I think striving, that unhealthy type of striving, can become a habit for folks. And then maybe we can look at how we could apply that model to helping us thrive in our lives. But let's just get back to the basics of reward-based learning and your very basic model of what gets us hooked into addictive states.
Yes, and I would say this model, so it's a model that I like, but it's not one that I came up with. So I've got to give a hat tip to actually as early as the Buddha. The Buddhist psychology described this reward-based learning process over 2,500 years ago. It was rediscovered, let's say, in the late 1800s by Ed Thorndike. B.F. Skinner became famous around it. Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for it. So I'm really just kind of standing on the shoulders of giants here. And the basic process is one that just helps us survive. Three necessary and sufficient elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward or a result. So think of our ancient ancestors out on the savannah having to find food. They see the food, there's the trigger. They eat the food, that's the behavior. And then their stomach sends this dopamine signal to their brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So it really helps us learn things. That's the basic context for learning. So positive reinforcement, we learn to repeat things that feel pleasant or give us a positive reward. Negative reinforcement, we learn to avoid things that are unpleasant. And that actually makes up, the majority of our waking life, where we've learned everything from tying our shoes to eating, to some of the habits that might not be so healthy, like checking social media a little too much. So that's the basic premise. Now, you talk about striving being a habit. Let's dive right into that. So we could actually, the way I think about this is we could map this out. So what might, let me ask you, give me an example of where somebody might be striving. Like what would trigger them to strive as that behavior?
Sure. I work a lot with high performance folks, people that are high achievers. And so something that may trigger striving is social comparison, seeing someone that's, getting ahead. of them in some domain of their life.
That's a great example. It's interesting in that I'll refer back to the bit of psychology again, because this reminds me of something that I learned there, where they talk about comparison back then, before there was social media, before there was electricity. And they said, worse than, better than, same as. All of these cause suffering. So let's say somebody goes on social media and they compare themselves to somebody else. It doesn't matter if they go on there and they're like, oh, that person, I wish I had that, worse than, or, oh, I got them beat in a heartbeat, better than, or, wow, that's about what I relate to, same as. All of that can trigger that striving that can lead to suffering. So let's say somebody sees somebody on social media doing something that they're like, oh, I want to do that. That can create this urge to go out there and strive. Like, I want to do better. I want to do what this person is doing. So striving can be triggered all sorts of different ways. Now, that striving piece that I'm talking about is the urge to want to do, right? That's the part, that pushing, I've got to do better. I want to do more. That can feel really driven. It can feel contracted. And if we look at the neuroscience here, this goes back to dopamine, that starts with fire. Dopamine fires when something unexpected happens. That's when we learn. And then it shifts firing to anticipating doing something. So anticipation, looking forward to, getting excited about doing something in the future. That's the dopamine firing up and saying, go do this, go do this. And I think striving can be triggered in the same way, where we see somebody doing something, we compare ourselves, and then we say, oh, I got to do that. There's that contracted quality that says, go do something, strive. And then we can look at the various results that come from striving. There's
the dopamine component of the drivenness, but there's this other component when you talk about Buddhist psychology. It's both attachment and aversion, right? So there's the drive, the attachment to self, but then sometimes it's also about aversion to the discomfort of what's behind that. That's sort of I'm not good enough, or the anxiety that may be driving it. And both of those are happening. Are those happening in different parts of our brain, or is that sort of one system that is driving attachment and aversion?
So from what I understand, there's part of the brain, for example, the nucleus accumbens, that seems to receive inputs probably in slightly different parts, depending on if you look at animal models versus humans. It's a little easier to, do the recordings and things like that on animals. But it's interesting, the pleasantness and the unpleasantness both seem to converge on the same pathway that says do something, right? Mm-hmm. That's really what motivated behavior is all about. It motivates us, whether it's holding on to pleasant things or pushing away unpleasant things. The motivation is still there that says, go do something. And I think that's where they share a downstream pathway.
Okay, great. So we have this sort of habit loop of there's a trigger, could be social comparison. You go into striving or selfing, trying to make yourself better, or not trying at all because you feel like you never will get that good. And then there's the result or the consequence associated with that is often dissatisfying for folks.
Yes.
So one of the things that you write a lot about in Unwinding Anxiety is just helping people begin with the awareness of mapping out habit loops. Can you talk about how you do that with folks, that sort of first gear, that first step?
And maybe I'll give a brief example of how I do this clinically, because it might just kind of highlight how this works in real life. I wrote about a gentleman, I call him Dave in the Unwinding Anxiety book, who was referred to me for anxiety. I started taking his history, and it turned out that he had full-blown panic disorder. He had full-blown generalized anxiety disorder. And his generalized anxiety disorder had been there probably for about 30 years. He was about 40 years of age when he came to see me. And it turned out that he had this ongoing anxiety for about 30 years. And after I got a little bit of the information, I just pulled out a blank piece of paper and I wrote down trigger, behavior, result on it, or reward, result/reward. And I said, okay, let me make sure I've got this right. And I just said, okay, what's the trigger? For him, his panic disorder was related to driving on the highway. So he would have a thought like he was in a speeding bullet. I think he described it. So I wrote that down. Okay, triggers a thought, behavior, avoid driving on the highway. And then the result was that he could avoid getting panic attacks. And that result feeds back so that the next time he's triggered, it reinforces the behavior. So we took literally 30 seconds, mapped out that habit loop, and he had this light bulb moment where he's like, oh, I didn't realize my mind works that way. So, so it's really that simple in terms of the beginning. If we don't know how our mind works, we can't possibly work with it. So just mapping out those habit loops, and boy, we have tons of them. So we actually created a free habit mapper. Anybody can map it, download it. I think it's mapmyhabit.com, where basically you just trigger behavior result. You go through your day, you just map these things out, and you start to bring into focus, bring into awareness all these things that we're doing automatically that we don't know, that are self-perpetuating based on their rewards.
Yes, that automatic component is so important, because a lot of our habits, we're not even noticing what's happening or why it's happening. We're just doing it. And then we repeat it over and over and over in our lives. And then we say, well, how did I end up here? Yeah. I think it was James Clear that said that our skin is the result of our habits around our sunscreen use. Our finances are the results of our habits around our, savings. So we can start to map out this habit loop. And in unwinding anxiety, you really focus on the habit loop associated with anxiety. But it seems like this could apply to a lot of different things that people struggle with. And really just getting that first step of awareness and, mindfulness, I guess is another term for that, is cracking the puzzle a little bit. So then you can put it back together in a different way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like you're pointing out, the unwinding anxiety books based on, using the core example of anxiety. But this was based on research that I've been doing for several decades, where we'd worked with people with alcohol use disorder, with cocaine use disorder, with smoking. We gotten 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. We worked with folks with eating. So all of, the basic premise can be used for anything, for any behavior. And in fact, this isn't in the book because the book was in publication when we published this, but we just published a review paper suggesting that there is actually this pathway that's right in front of us that doesn't involve willpower in terms of changing a habit. And so in that sense, we can think of, breaking the habit of the forced, the grit striving, and shifting into a different way of striving, which is more natural, more joyful, more effortless, or less effortful.
So there's this paper that came out a while back on learned helplessness. And it was called like Learned Helplessness 50 Years Later by Seligman and Mayer. And they were talking about sort of what they've learned, what's changed about their understanding of learned helplessness. And I think for a lot of us, we sort of take this approach that, oh, this is just, this is sort of this learned helpless habit loop. But what they talk about in that paper is that it's actually not the helplessness that's learned, it's the control that's learned. It's actually our brain can learn a sense of control. And then they go off to like the whole CBT world. But I actually think what you talk about is a sense of control, but it's not about controlling emotions. It's about creating a new habit loop by controlling your behavior, by controlling your attention, by controlling what you're putting in that behavior part of that little cycle. So can we talk about that next part of like how you kind of harness a little control over this automatic habit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this is where I think the whole journey is fascinating. Like I didn't even realize that anxiety could be a habit. I didn't learn that in residency. And this other piece I recently learned, through some of our research as well. So there's actually there's a mathematical formula that goes back to the 1970s, by Rescorla and Wagner. And what they suggest, and this is still true today, people still use this model in neuroscience today. What they suggest is that one, behavior gets set up based on how rewarding it is. So something's more rewarding than something else. Given a choice, we'll do the thing that's more rewarding, right? And so that helps us be efficient in our daily lives. We don't have to relearn everything and make decisions like, oh, do I eat chocolate or broccoli? Our brain's like, dude, chocolate, of course, and we don't have to relearn that all the time. So we set up these reward hierarchies. And then the other thing that this model suggests is that the only way to change these is to update the reward value. So there's an error term in this. So basically it's current reward value equals past reward value plus an error term. And that error term is based on awareness, meaning you can either get a positive prediction error or a negative prediction error. I'll unpack those. So let's use an example. Let's say that I'll use myself as an example. Chocolate cake. I have a certain reward value for chocolate cake in my brain, right? I like it generally more than say carrot cake, although carrot cake's all right. So let's say I walk down a street and I see a new bakery open. and I see some chocolate cake in the window. And I say, oh, chocolate cake. So I go inside and I eat a piece. Now, if it's the best chocolate cake that I've ever had, I'm like, oh my goodness, I get this positive prediction error because my brain predicted that it was going to be X rewarding and it was X plus 1,000 or whatever. So I learn, go back to that bakery, go back as often as you can. Now, if I go in and I eat the cake and I'm like, meh, I've had better, I get a negative prediction error where my brain's like, yeah, these guys, they could learn a little thing about making chocolate cake. Not that I could do it better, but there's this, and I go back to the other bakery that has a higher reward value. Long story short, it's all dependent on awareness. I have to pay attention as I eat the cake. If I eat the cake and I'm chatting with somebody and they're like, how's the cake? And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't pay attention. Then it doesn't change. My reward value doesn't change. And I don't know if this bakery is any good. It's not terrible or it's not fabulous because that would have charged my brain to say, hey, put down the phone, stop talking to this person, pay attention to the cake. So that is a critical component because none of that relies on willpower. Nowhere in that equation says grit or, think of something better or force yourself or control yourself. The only critical ingredient there is awareness. And that's where mindfulness comes in because mindfulness says, pay attention to what's happening. If it's rewarding, you'll keep doing it. If it's not rewarding, you'll stop. And in fact, my lab we just published a study showing with this Eat Right Now app, we have people do a mindful eating exercise. We can measure the reward value. It only takes 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention as they overeat for them to stop that. No effort as part of that, just awareness. So that's the basic premise, is based on this neuroscience approach that says, hey, awareness is critical. And the other piece to that is that we can actually find intrinsically rewarding behaviors that we can draw upon at any time. And I think of two flavors of that. One is curiosity and one is kindness. So we can get curious about our experience. And we can also, like if we're judging ourselves, we mentioned that earlier, if we're judging ourselves, we can compare what it feels like to judge ourselves to what it feels like to be kind to ourselves. To our brains, it's a no-brainer, right? If we can really pay attention, the judgment drops in the reward value and the kindness goes up.
So what you're doing there is you're remapping that mind map so that the trigger still occurs. And sure, we can try and remove triggers, but honestly, we live in a world where they're just getting better at rewarding our brains. It's just, our food is designed to activate our dopamine. Our screens are designed. People are very skilled and make a lot of money at this. So we may or may not be able to change the triggers. Can be helpful, but you're really talking about the behavior and the reward part. And would you say that mindfulness attention is a behavior?
Well, it's a great question. I wouldn't say that it's a behavior. So let's just take the element of awareness, right? Mm-hmm. Just to be super clear here. Awareness is a capacity that we all have that that we can, if we can direct it through attention, like paying attention to something. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say awareness is a behavior itself. Awareness can help change behavior by being aware of something, but I wouldn't say awareness is a behavior itself. How does that land with you?
I think it's a behavior.
Oh, say more. Let's do this. Yeah.
Because there's a choice there of me placing my attention on something, or I can choose to, it's almost like a lean back, like I can choose to open up to awareness, or I can choose to lean into curiosity. But yeah, so I would see it as potentially a new behavior in that habit loop. But I could also see how sometimes awareness is just sort of like grace that comes to you that you're not necessarily choosing. It's sort of like a sleep.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. But I do think curiosity is a behavior, and that is something that we can turn on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that resonates more with me in terms of we can be it just seems like awareness is this natural capacity. Like you're saying, it could be a sleep. We can either be aware or not aware of something. But I think of a behavior as something, like you're saying, that we choose to do. Curiosity feels more like it's in that behavioral category where, and I would say awareness and curiosity are separable. Although if you look at mindfulness, that attitudinal quality of curiosity that comes together with awareness is often how people talk about mindfulness, the concept of mindfulness. But I would say awareness, you can be aware and not curious, right? So you can separate them, but you can also be aware and kind of awaken that curiosity. And in that sense, I could see curiosity being reinforced as a behavior because it feels rewarding. My lab's actually done studies on this. We've looked at the reward value, say, of curiosity versus judgment or anger or anxiety or things like that, and it definitely feels very different. Not only people report it as being more rewarding, but it feels more open and expanded than, say, anger, anxiety, frustration. Those all feel more closed.
So when you're mapping out your new habit loop, you're almost replacing or putting in a new behavior there of curiosity and kindness, which can be a behavior like I'm practicing kindness towards myself or practicing kindness towards another person. And then that results in what you talk about, sort of this bigger, better offer, this reinforcement that's much deeper and much more intrinsic, as opposed to the sort of short-term reinforcement of that dopamine hit associated with like yummy cake.
Yes, exactly. And the dopamine hit, interestingly, it often happens in anticipation. So we see the cake, we get a dopamine hit that says, go eat that. What are you waiting for? There's this restless quality that drives us to do something. That's where cravings come from. But that's actually separable from the pleasure, the hedonic quality of the cake itself. And so we can enjoy cake, or we could want the cake so much that we're actually anticipating the next bite and not paying attention to the one that's in our mouth.
Yeah. So let's substitute all sorts of things with cake. That could be like a romantic relationship, or that could be making a certain amount of money, or having a certain career goal, or having a certain body. And that's where some of that sort of ego-based and, anticipation of something good in the future, but that goalpost keeps on getting moved. So I have a question around that, because you're super interested in curiosity. It seems like that's your thing. And there's like a new thought on happiness, that there may be 3 different parts to happiness. There's like the happiness that's about pleasure, the hedonic happiness. And then there's happiness that's about meaning and purpose. But then there's a third happiness that people are starting to talk about called psychological richness, which has to do with curiosity, interest, openness to new perspectives, and wisdom. And it seems like that's the arena that you live in more in relationship to our habits, like how to shift out of the pleasure mode and into these other sort of deeper aspects of satisfaction in life, which also links to Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting because I've not heard these 3 differentiations before. So just responding in real time, I can see if we're always seeking pleasure, we're never going to be satisfied. So if you talk about, Buddhist psychology, they had this concept of a hungry ghost, which was this ghost with this long, narrow esophagus and a huge stomach. And so no matter how much it ate, it could never get enough food in its stomach to be satisfied, right? That's what life is like. I remember, it reminds me of this quote from John D. Rockefeller, one of the robber barons or whatever, one of the richest guys in the world in his time. Somebody asked him, how much is enough? And he said, just a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter if they're even the richest guy, literally one of the richest people in the world. If we're always striving for more, we're never going to be satisfied. So that grasping quality can drive us to not live very rich or meaningful lives if we're just constantly on that, what is the proverbial hedonic treadmill, trying to get more with these little hits of excitement or pleasure or anticipating things in the future, versus really stepping in, I guess, looking at these 2 other elements where there can be more of a eudaimonic happiness, where people talk about contentment as compared to excitement. And then, my favorite piece, which is curiosity, where we can bring an attitude of curiosity to each moment of our lives, where we're just opening to, and we're just fascinated with what's happening right now, as compared to saying, I want to be focusing on tomorrow or next week. It's like, oh, what's happening right now? And boy, it is so much richer to be, no matter we're driving down the street, we're stopping at a red light, instead of like pulling out our phone to check our news feed because we're so restless that we can't sit for 30 seconds at a stoplight. We can look around. Oh, what does red actually look like right now? Like there's so much that could just really draw us in right now. And boy, that's the way I like to live. It feels so much better.
And it also opens you up to not just going on autopilot and already knowing. Like if you're curious, you're in a constant state of learning, which is incredibly satisfying as well, to be learning.
I'm so glad you bring that up. Yes, we can be constantly learning, and boy, we can look to see how much more helpful this is in our lives. So professionally, as a psychiatrist, much better for me not to jump to conclusions when somebody walks in the door and I'm like, oh, this person's like this, as compared to, oh, what's your story? It's going to help our connection. It's going to help me be able to treat them. And boy, everybody's story is so different. I certainly don't get burnt out. I get excited, oh, new patient. Whoa, let's see what their story is. So professionally, really helpful. As a researcher, boy, anybody that's not curious is really not a researcher. If they're just trying to prove something that they think is true and then forcing that, as compared to having a hypothesis and being excited whether they prove it or disprove it, doesn't matter. Here's the science. This is what we're learning. But also personally, when we come to our partner and instead of just assuming they're going to be this way or that way, we just truly like pay attention to them. Like how often have we actually gone to our partner and looked deeply into their eyes? Like what do you look like right now? Not what do I assume you look like, but let me just take a few seconds to just truly look at you. And what would it be like if we truly listened every moment? It's so much richer, so much richer.
Yeah, I think that where that tends to show up more when we start to see things as being impermanent, or we get close to the possibility of loss, then all of a sudden we're dialed in, but we spend a lot of our time not in that space of realizing that everything we love will lose at some point. So here's what I still can't quite wrap my head around this with you, which is, here's this guy that has PhD, MD, Buddhist, scholar, and incredibly prolific, and working on anxiety. How do you manage all of that and stay healthy? Like how do you keep, practice what you preach, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. It feels like it was kind of a serendipitous road. I started meditating at the beginning of medical school because I was stressed out. Mm-hmm. And I got curious. I was like, oh, this stuff actually works, wow. So I was learning personally what was actually helping me find meaning, live a richer life, and not get lost in rabbit holes of like, oh, let me try to get a gazillion likes on this, on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. It's like, oh, paying attention to that, seeing, wow, that's really not that satisfying, and becoming disenchanted with that so that I could really stay focused on things that felt rewarding. And so I would say, in a nutshell, it's really about following my, it's comes back to curiosity, just really being curious, like, oh, is this helpful for me? Is this harmful for me? Is this helpful for other people? Is this harmful? And then seeing what really brings true meaning, because meaning is so energizing, having purpose. And for me, I'm sure you feel the same way. It feels really good to help people. I know that sounds a little cliche, or, people might say, oh, you're just, was it virtue signaling or something like that? And I'm like, try it for yourself. When you're kind to people, why would you want to do anything else? And so it's kind of like, I just kind of fell into some of these things where it's like, oh, that feels pretty good. Like, being a jerk doesn't feel very good. Being less of a jerk feels much better than that. And then just, kind of moving in that direction. And then seeing clinically how things like mindfulness training could really step in where we were not doing a great job in research and clinical elsewhere, like with addictions. It's like really hard to treat addictions. Oh, oh, can we help some people this way? And then I get inspired when my patients do well, and then that brings meaning, and that keeps driving me forward. And then that gets me more interested in like really understanding what this awareness and curiosity stuff's all about. So I practice it more myself. So I do more research on it. And then I just get drawn more and more in. I remember somebody asking me, like, hey, could you do an experiment where you just stopped being mindful for a couple of weeks to see what that was like? And I remember my brain just jumping in and being like, why would you ever do that? Because it's so rewarding to be curious. It's so rewarding to be kind as compared to, prejudging things or being mean to people. It's just like, I feel like I can't go back.
Well, I think that's the case of awareness, that sometimes once you become aware of something, you can't not be aware of it. If stuff like, I've worked a lot in the field of eating disorders. So people become aware of what they're experiencing while they're binge eating. It's really hard to go back and binge on that same thing again and just check out, because you are now aware of it. And part of that is also building the pathways of awareness in the brain and strengthening that neuroplasticity. Can we talk a little bit about what's happening in the brain when you're building this, practice of mindfulness and awareness, especially in the arena of shifting out of that self-focus into the being kind, meaning aspect?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Another fascinating story that my lab's been studying for over a decade now. So, we actually published our first study on this back in 2011, where we just asked a simple question, experienced meditators versus novice meditators, what's different in their brains? And good thing we were curious, because I had the hypothesis that some part of the brain or some network would activate more in experienced versus novice meditators. Dead wrong. So because I was like, I feel like I'm doing something. This is way back when I was striving, when I was meditating. Mm-hmm. we can talk about that if helpful. But we looked to see, we flipped the thing on its head and said, okay, well, is there anything else that's different? Is there anything that's less active in experienced meditators versus novices? And lo and behold, this network of brain regions called the default mode network, which is basically the selfing network, because it gets activated when we think about ourselves, think about ourselves in the past, think about ourselves in the future, get caught up in cravings, gets activated. Okay. And with anxiety, it gets, when you worry, the more you worry, the more two hubs of this default mode network get activated, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. Those are the exact hubs of the network that get deactivated with meditation. So we went on to do a bunch of neurophenomenologic studies to really line this up. And what we found was that the more somebody got caught up in their experience, so if somebody gets caught up in a craving or gets caught up in worrying or caught up in social comparison, they activate the default mode network. There's even a study from UCLA showing with adolescents with Instagram feeds. The more likes they got on an Instagram feed, the more they activated their reward centers, but also the more they activated this default mode network, right? Me. So mindfulness, or I think of it as curious awareness, the more curious we are, the less active this network gets, and the more open we feel. So instead of getting contracted, like, oh, I got to like, or oh, I'm worried about something, the more we open to our experience, the less active this network is, and the more connected we feel with the rest of the world, the more we actually lose a sense of self. If you look at Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which he describes as effortless and selfless, that's a feeling of such openness that we don't even know where we end and the rest of the world begins. So I think that network has lined up the most with kind of getting caught up in our experience, from craving to anxiety to whatever, and also in letting go of our experience, whether it's kindness or curiosity. And in fact, my lab published a study back in 2014 looking at loving kindness meditation, which is a selfless type of meditation. It's just this well-wishing, we can use phrases to support it, but really it's this feeling of well-wishing that feels very open and expanded. And we found that this network gets deactivated when people are practicing loving kindness as well.
It's so interesting because it feels better. Subjectively, it feels better to not be in that self-focus mode. But then it also kind of feels better to be in that self-focus mode. When you think about someone that's going through, I was just working with someone that's going through a breakup, and I swear I try and use your habit loops with folks. And sometimes they say, can I just vent? I don't want to be curious right now. I just want to talk about how much I hate this person. And I want to just like grind on my resentment for really, 45 minutes of our 50-minute hour. And then we'll give you, 5 minutes for change. But there is something about that, like going around the hamster wheel of resentment or worry that is reinforcing. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So here, and I find this clinically as well, somebody has to be in a place where they're feeling ready to change. Like you're saying, I give them 5 minutes of change at the end, which is great. So it's kind of like you got to clear out this stuff. You got to clear out the baggage before somebody is open to like, okay, you got to release that. Okay, let's focus on the change. So if we zoom in on that venting, somebody's like, it basically, it's like me, right? And it's not a negative thing. I'm just saying like that venting, that person did this to me, we can think of all the different scenarios there. There's often an excited, empowered quality where they're like, oh yeah. And sometimes it's just really important for somebody to feel empowered in that moment. Was it Jack Engler who said you need a self to transcend the self, before you can transcend the self? So sometimes we got to get up to a place. We've got to climb up to the platform that we can then transcend or jump off in a good way, right? And so sometimes that's just what's needed in that moment. And then that opens the space where somebody feels comfortable enough or they feel calm enough after they've kind of released to be able to then open to change. I don't know. Is that how you've noticed it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely with motivational interviewing, so much of that is based on self-determination theory and client-centered approaches, where if you start arguing against, someone's resentment, they're just going to become more resentful and they kind of have to meet them in that relatedness. Like, I'm here, I'm on your side, and saddling up to them for a little bit. This is helpful just for folks that are parents of teens or in a relationship with somebody else. Don't argue against them, but maybe find that opening where then there's a little bit of change talk happening. There's a little bit of, well, gosh, I've just realized I'm kind of been talking a lot about how horrible this guy is. And I'm kind of sick of it. It's sort of like noticing that point of diminishing returns with the chocolate cake. Maybe that's the same case with venting. We need to kind of get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we can even look at, like, what do I get from this? That's the question I have people ask when they're, when they're overeating or when they're overventing, let's say.
Yeah. Overselfing.
Like you said,
yeah.
There's a pleasure plateau where it starts to diminish. And then we go off the other end where it just starts to feel icky. It's like, ooh, I just went on and on and on about this person. How do I feel right now? Ooh, not great. And then we can compare that to growth, to kindness, to all these other things and see which one feels better.
And it's that difference between like discernment versus self-judgment. So you're like looking at it from a, scientific view of like, or curious, I wonder when is the point of diminishing returns versus, oh my gosh, here I am venting again. I'm such a loser, or here I am overeating again. I'm such a loser, which takes us down a totally different pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can actually feel into the difference between those two. So when we're like, oh, I'm a bad person, that feels closed and contracted. And when I think you put it,
that's how you put it. I got that from you.
Okay, great. But that signals curiosity. And when we're curious about something, we're actually, as Carol Dweck puts it, we're in our growth zone as compared to our fixed mindset. We're like, oh, I'm a bad person. That's that fixed mindset as compared to growth mindset. What's this like? What can I learn from this?
Okay. So back to your habit loop. We identify sort of what the trigger is that triggers me to go into the behavior that it's not really working for me because I've started to look at this. I've written it out. Like, I actually would suggest people sit down and write it out like you did with your patient a while back. And then you work on bringing awareness. And the other word that you used is disenchantment. So is there an actual practice to help you with the disenchantment part, with the recognizing this isn't working for me? Do you actually embody that as well? Like, notice what it feels like and linger on that for longer? Yes. Or
yeah. And that's the critical piece. So I like to keep things simple. And so I just have people ask themselves, what am I getting from this? Not intellectually. And, it's not like that's a bad thing, but really feel into their direct experience. because our thinking brains don't hold a candle to our feeling bodies, right? Our feeling bodies are really what drive behavior. As much as we'd like to think we can think our way out of things, it's really, the thinking mind convincing our body to go do something, and then it goes and does something. So I have people just really ask themselves, what am I getting from this? And feel into their direct experience, right? How does it feel? Does it feel closed and contracted? Does it feel unpleasant versus does it feel open and expanded? Does it feel, more pleasant? And if it's unrewarding, that's where they start to develop disenchantment. A key aspect here of reward-based learning is, like you said earlier, triggers, if we could change triggers, but we often can't. Triggers aren't actually in that equation. They aren't in the Rescorla-Wagner model. So triggers don't matter that much, in the sense that, if we get trigger, if there's a trigger there or not, that's not what changes the behavior. It's how rewarding the behavior is. And in that sense, the behavior itself isn't even that important, which seems crazy. But it's really how rewarding the behavior is that drives future behavior as compared to the behavior itself, right? And that helps us see, it doesn't matter. It could be any behavior that I'm getting sucked into or I'm getting stuck in. It's how rewarding that is. And that's that curious, that awareness element there that comes with, what am I getting from this, with that question? So that's really that second step. If you think of this as a 3-step, process, map it out first step, ask yourself, what am I getting from this as that second step, and back to striving, if I'm forcing this, what am I getting from this? Which then leads into this third step of the bigger, better offer. What feels better? And so if we have a goal, we could force ourselves to reach that goal, or we could find another path to reach that goal. I'll give an example. So the patient that I mentioned with anxiety, we mapped it out and all that. This gentleman was also 180 pounds overweight. Okay. And so I didn't even talk to him about weight loss at the first visit, because we were just going to focus on anxiety. And I sent him home. I sent him home with our Unwinding Anxiety app. And I said, just map out your habit loops. He comes back 2 weeks later, and no kidding, the first thing he says to me is, I lost 14 pounds. And I'm looking at him like, what? Great. How do we do that? And he said, I realized that when I was mapping these out, anxiety triggers me to stress eat. Stress eating isn't actually fixing my anxiety. It's actually making me feel guilty. So I stopped doing it. So there's disenchantment. The next thing that he did was to start really exploring, how does it feel when I eat junk food, when I overeat, all this, as compared to when I don't. And so he had this direct comparison, this bigger, better offer of not overeating, where he felt like he was more in control, et cetera, et cetera. Literally just yesterday, he came in for we had a virtual clinic visit, and he has now lost 150 pounds. And he said, this is great, because it felt so effortless, because I would just pay attention and ask myself, what am I getting from this? Right? If I try to force myself to lose weight, it never lasted. But if I just get curious and ask myself, what am I getting from this? I can naturally step away from the process. And literally yesterday, he was talking about just being able to walk around in his body that was now 150 pounds lighter. And he said, this is a real bigger, better offer. It just feels good to be able to move the way I can now, where I couldn't move that way before. So there's a great example of that third step of that bigger, better offer.
And I think what's so important in that story is that the bigger, better offer wasn't the weight loss. It was the feeling of engaging in the behavior in the moment, in the present moment, that felt different, that felt more aligned with maybe his values, but also just sort of felt better to him, because we can get hooked on that outcome piece of the weight loss. And I see this all the time with weight gain, weight loss, whatever, where it's like, oh no, it's like that example where it's like the same, less or more, no matter what, you're screwed. So if you lost weight, you're like, oh no, how am I going to keep doing that? And then you're anxious, and then you end up overeating. Or if you're the same, you're mad. Or if you're more. But the focusing on the behavior, the focusing on the bigger, better offer in the present moment, that then eventually may or may not help you get to the outcome that you're hoping for, but most likely it will.
Yeah. And I just want to highlight that, because that is so important what you just said. He's not focused on losing X number of pounds. Think of that as like destination, right? Oh, I got to get somewhere. If you want to strive, like pick a goal and just try to force yourself to get there, not knowing how you're going to get there. He's focused on the journey itself. He's like, well, I'm just going to focus on this moment today and what I eat right now. How does it feel? Oh, when I eat healthy food, it feels good as compared to eating junk food. When I beat myself up, when I eat some ice cream, it's not like he never eats, unhealthy food, but he just pays attention and he's like, oh, that didn't do it for me. And so that reinforces the process for him. For him, it's the journey. And when it's the journey, when we're not trying to get somewhere, how can we be striving, right? We're actually moving, but we're not striving.
So that can apply to anything from like changing your eating habits. It can also apply to anxiety. It's not about getting rid of the anxiety. It's not about getting rid of the craving, but it's really tending to the process of how do I want to be right now in this moment with this anxiety or this craving. And the idea of that, like our control isn't around necessarily the weight or the craving. Our control is how we respond when that shows up. Because I love your research on cigarette use, and basically people kept craving cigarettes, but they stopped smoking. So, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for that type of change. And something like weight loss, my goodness, I mean, that's a long haul. So you need to have another motivator besides the scale if you're going to change your eating habits.
Yeah, absolutely. And any moment we can pay attention to how we relate to ourselves, whether it's like you're talking about how we relate to the anxiety, how we relate to our food, how we relate to our ego or our self-image, right? So we can be judging ourselves, we can be comparing, or we could just be accepting, and curious, what's happening right now?
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so where do you get stuck then? Where do you get hooked? Or do you feel fairly enlightened that you don't get hooked anymore?
Far from it. Well, there are probably many things. I'm trying to think of a concrete example. And I would say, the hooks, there are plenty of hooks. Mm-hmm. They just feel like they hook less now. So I'm able to recognize them more quickly and not have that hook go as deeply. Let's say, ice cream, for example. Okay. So for me, I'm finding that actually eating a whole food plant-based diet, like where I'm really cutting down on dairy is making a big difference in my life. So I used to have chronic Achilles tendonitis when you run a lot and then do sports. And I found that was really helpful. So in the long term, that was certainly the bigger, better offer. Occasionally, there's a couple of great ice cream places near where I live. And so it's like, I want some of that ice cream. And then just noticing when I get up to the counter, like, how many scoops do you want? Where my old brain is like, can you fit 12 scoops on a cone? Is that possible? How good are you? It's packing those in there, and then my brain, and then I'll ask, well, what do I actually get from eating a ton versus just eating some? And it's like, so I've certainly, it helps me cut down on, especially when I'm indulging in ice cream. So that there's certainly a hook that I get to deal with, especially in the summer.
Okay. So you got to give me a juicier one than that, because everyone has that hook. Do you have anything that's like more, I don't know, related to work or striving in that realm? Like you're in a super high pressure situation, academia, you've been at some of the most highly renowned universities. Do you not get hooked in the self there?
Maybe, and hopefully I don't think it's because I'm getting burnt out, but it seems like I'm thinking of all these things, it's like, publish more papers or do more. And my brain's like, why bother? It just seems like there's a lot of hype around something that there doesn't need to be hype around. And so it's like, well, if I get promoted, I'll get promoted. If I don't, I guess I'm done with, it's like, my brain's like, I'd rather focus on other things. Yeah. So it's not like I'm perfect, but it's just, there's just something where I've hit where it just feels so much better not to worry about all the stuff that people worry about. And that actually frees up. So a couple of years ago, I started surfing, and it frees up my brain to be like, well, let's go surfing. Yeah. So there, it has really helped with the work-life balance, where it's like, well, I could spend my life striving, but I know that doesn't feel very good. Or I could do my best and really be fully immersed when I'm doing my work, and then go surfing, and I could enjoy that too, and not be thinking about work when I'm surfing, or whatever, spending time with my wife. So I can't think of something specific where I'm totally hooked at work, but it's probably because I've been so hooked before. I'm like, yeah, I've been there. Why would I do that again?
Yeah, well, you're disenchanted. You're disenchanted by it. And, instead of getting off of that hamster wheel of self-improvement and actually enjoying your life. And I think it was Jung that said, we spend the first 40 years of our life building up our ego and then the next 40 breaking it down. So maybe you've crested and now you're like in the let's dismantle this thing because it is a pain and a thorn in my side, and start enjoying my life more. And you certainly exude that in who you are. And in some ways you kind of do better work when you have that stance.
So that's a really good point. It's rewarding to get out of my own way. It's rewarding to not be attached to my own concepts. It's rewarding to not to try to climb all over everybody else to get ahead, and instead work with everybody else and collaborate. It's so much more fun. And like you said, we do much better work, collaboratively. If I'm teaching or if I'm doing research or if I'm developing a program, it's so much more fun. And it gets, it's better. It's better together, when we do it together. And so the reward piece comes in there as well. So there's some reward-based learning. There's an example of it.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked before we started this conversation, we talked about how sometimes it's just about really simplifying things, and we don't have to make things more complicated than they are. Sometimes making things complicated just leads us astray. What is sort of your simple takeaway around striving and how to help people?
Yeah, my simple takeaway would be, one, I would say bring some curiosity to what's happening, in all aspects of this. It's like, what am I striving for? And really investigate, is this a worthy goal? Is this meaningful for me? Is this meaningful for others? Is this going to bring people together? Is it going to drive people apart? So bring some curiosity there, and then bring curiosity into the process. Like, how am I going about achieving my goals? What does it feel like in the moment? Am I destination oriented or am I journey oriented? And then related to that, the third piece is, what does it feel like in my body? Does it feel contracted? Does it feel closed? Does that feel like I'm depleted at the end of the day? Versus does it feel open and expanded where I'm energized and I'm excited to wake up the next morning and get going again? So those would be, I guess, three related aspects that I would say. And it really comes back down to, distilling it to curiosity. We can be curious in each of those elements because the rest will take care of itself. Our brains know what to do. And our job is to get out of the way of our brains because they do a good job of helping us see what is really meaningful, what is really helpful, what is really going to move us forward.
Great. And so for folks that want to break it down into like concrete daily action to take in their lives, I think your apps are fantastic. I've been working with a couple of clients that have been using your apps, and they are like religiously using the app, and it's sustained. So it's because you've broken it down into just really small bite-sized pieces that people can use pretty much every day when they need it. And then you're building this skill set that's actually rewarding to use. So do you want to just share a little bit about your apps, and if people want to continue this habit loop work, how they can start to do it in their daily life?
Sure. And so folks can go to my website, drjud.com, where it's got information on all of these things. But the short summary of these is that we've taken evidence-based trainings, and all of these are studied clinically and even neuroscientifically, where we can see the reward value, or where we can see the neural networks change. For example, with our smoking program, we recently published a paper on that. But basically, it's videos, animations, short in the moment exercises that people can use on a daily basis. So it's a progressive training where they get about 10 minutes of training a day, where they get a little bit of brain learning, where we teach them a concept, and then we move it right into their direct experience so they can develop wisdom and say, okay, try this out today, use this, throughout your day. So the idea is somebody would wake up in the morning, they'd do 10 minutes of training, they would get an instruction or an inspiration to say, okay, try this throughout the day, build it into your daily life. That's how new habits form, short moments many times throughout the day. And then, for example, the Craving and Quit program for smoking, it's 22 core modules. The Eat Right Now program for emotional eating, for overeating, is 28 core modules. And then the Unwinding Anxiety app is 30 core modules. And all of these have theme weeks that come after that, where they can deepen concepts that they really want to dive into more. The other thing that's really fun for me is all of these have a online community component. So I moderate this community where I learn from them, and I can answer questions and things like that. And we get to go on a live Zoom group every week. We do it noon Eastern, so we can reach the West Coast, we can reach Europe. We do one of our moderators does something on the Asian time zone on Tuesdays. And then we can all come together and people can ask questions and we can interact. And then, we can do some inquiry and explore where somebody's struggling and gives them some tips, and everybody can learn from that. And so I feel like I get to come together with a community every week. I've been doing this 5 years now, 5 or 6 years, where it's like every week, and we've only missed 1 or 2 weeks because of major holidays over the course of 5 years, just because it's so fun. Like I want to keep coming back. So that's another aspect of the apps that we provide to people, because I think community is really critical, especially this day and age where we're alone together, as Sherry Turkle puts it.
Yeah. Well, it also just makes it really accessible for people that can't afford therapy, maybe don't have access to therapy or quality therapy. Sometimes people are in areas where there isn't evidence-based approaches being offered. So it gets you in their pocket. And honestly, when I pulled out my phone and looked at your little app, it's like, remember in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when Mike TV goes into the TV and he shrinks up into this little person? It's like this little tiny Jud on your phone. It's very cute. So it's like you have Jud in your pocket, and you're cheery and helpful and smart. And so all those things are nice to have in your pocket when maybe you're overwhelmed by a craving or just need someone outside yourself to help you navigate something hard. So they're awesome. I think people will really find them useful. So go check them out. And I guess I just want to close with this last little bit around thriving, and if you could just boil it down for yourself about, what helps you thrive, and people can take that away as maybe some ideas for them that they could also use.
Yeah, I would say 2 things. And what just comes up is I loved physics in high school, not so much in college, but I loved it in high school. And if you think of a vector, it's a force and a direction. Okay. So I start with the direction, like, where am I oriented? Am I oriented towards something that is meaningful versus not so mean? I'm going to look back on that and be like, wow, why did I spend so much time on Twitter? That's not very meaningful, So what's the direction? And then where's the force? And is that force kind of drawn from curiosity, where that curiosity naturally pulls me in that direction, right? When we're curious about something, we're naturally moving toward it, right? We don't have to force anything. It just draws us in. Or is that force something where it's like, I'm trying to shove it, and literally force it? So those are the 2 pieces, the direction and where's that force coming from? I think that really sums up striving for me in a non-striving way.
Yes, beautiful. Yeah, very much that choice point model, and also just kind of rewrote physics for me, because that was the one class that I hated. So you helped me with having a new habit loop around physics there. It's good. It's awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Brewer. It's always a delight to talk with you, and you're just a wealth of wisdom and wonderful personality and all the good stuff. So it's great to share this time with you. Thank you for taking time in your busy day. And I'm sure that folks will find it really helpful.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed this.